Good evening. I'm Allison Carter, Senior Editor with the University of Arizona Press, and welcome to our event, Famine Foods, Plants We Eat to Survive, book launch and discussion. Paul E. Minnis is a Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Oklahoma, now living in Tucson, Arizona, where he is a visiting scholar in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. He conducts research on the pre-Hispanic ethnobotany and archaeology of Northwest Mexico and the US Southwest. Although he has worked throughout the region, his first intensive archaeological research in the area was on the ancient Mimbres tradition centered on southwestern New Mexico, and his primary field research since 1984 has focused on Paquime and its regional setting in northwestern Chihuahua, Mexico. He has co-directed research projects in this area since 1989, and he has published extensively on ethnobotany. He is the author or editor of 14 books and numerous articles. He has been president of the Society of Ethnobiology, treasurer and press editor for the Society for American Archaeology, co-founder of the Southwest Symposium, and co-vice president of the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society. He has received the E.K. Janaki Amal Medal and the Byron Cummings Award, and he was a Sigma Xi Distinguished Lecturer. In his new book, ethnobiologist Paul Minnis includes 14 short case studies that examine the use of alternative foods in human societies throughout the world, from hunter-gatherers to major nations. When environmental catastrophes, war, corrupt governments, annual hunger seasons, and radical agricultural policies have threatened to starve populations, cultural knowledge and memories of food shortages have been crucial to the survival of millions of people. Our moderator tonight in discussion with Paul is Nancy Turner. Nancy is an ethnobotanist and Distinguished Professor Emerita with the School of Environmental Studies, University of Victoria, Canada. She has worked with First Nations elders and cultural specialists in Northwestern North America for over 50 years, helping to document, retain, and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and environments, including indigenous foods, materials, and traditional medicines. Her 2-volume book, Ancient Pathways, Ancestral Knowledge, July 2014, McGill-Queen's University Press, integrates her long-term research. She has authored or co-authored, co-edited 30 other books, including Plants of Haida Gwaii, The Earth's Blanket, Keeping It Living with Doug Duer, Saanich Ethnobotany with Richard Hebda, and Food Plants of Coastal First Peoples, and over 150 book chapters and papers. Her latest edited book is Plants, People, and Places: The Roles of Ethnobotany and Ethnoecology in Indigenous Peoples' Land Rights in Canada and Beyond, 2020. She has received a number of awards for her work, including membership in Order of British Columbia, 1999, and the Order of Canada, 2009. And honorary degrees from 4 Canadian universities. She has known Paul Minnis for many years. It's my pleasure to welcome Nancy Turner and University of Arizona Press author Paul Minnis.
Okay. Hello, and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning. I hear we have somebody from England. What I want to do is I don't want to do a PowerPoint presentation, but I have about 8 slides that I think will help frame and outline why I think this topic is fairly important. So if you give me just a minute, I will get those slides on. Okay. Oh, God, come on, get rid of that. I can't get it started because just a second, let me try this again. You can see part of it, I just can't get it start from the beginning. Does anybody know how to move the mute stop and share screen and all of that. Down, lower.
Just grab it.
Okay. Oh, there we go. My wife just told me how to do it. That's convenient. Okay, slideshow. Okay. There we go. Thank you. There's an enormous amount of research and interest in food. Not a surprise. The impression is that most of it is focused on the commonly eaten foods, and there's a lot on national cuisine. So I went and looked at Amazon and just did a quick search. And if you look up Mexican cuisine books, there's over 2,000, Italian, 3,000, French, 4,000, Chinese, over 4,000. And this is a little odd, British, over 6,000 from what I hear about British food. And there's just a lot of that and other kinds of things, food as a gastronomic experience, food as a part of cultural identity. Those are all very, very important. But, food, when you get down to the very basics, food is what keeps us alive. And what happens when there's insufficient food? How do people stay alive? What can they eat when there's insufficient food, where there are food shortages? And when you get into that kind of question, the amount of scholarships drops very, very low. You have incidental reports and histories and ethnographies and things of that nature, and some botanical work. There are a few regional studies, but things that are sort of a comparative wide look to give a broad overview are limited, as far as I know, really to just two things: the Famine Food book, and then also Robert Freeman, who lives in Tucson, has a famine food database, which is available online at Purdue University, and the webpage is below. He spent many, many years, in fact, decades, assembling a list of 1,600 and maybe a little bit more now, 1,600 plants that are used as famine foods. And it's an absolutely amazing and impressive piece of work that if you're interested in the topic, you ought to look at. So you have thousands of books about food when it's nice, and very few works about when food keeps you alive. Why is it not? Oh. In order to understand why it's important, let's look at the lethality of famines. Probably the worst famine ever for population loss was the disastrous Great Leap Forward famine in China from 1958 to 1961. The best guesses are between 15 and 33 million people died, with estimates going as high as 45 million. There's some other people have tried to figure out the cumulative deaths for famines post 1860, the 77 largest, and it's between almost 100 million and 150 million people died. And another person estimated in the 20th century, the accumulated deaths from starvation are 75 million. Famines are lethal. They're clearly one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Famines are all common, very common, and they occur every part of the world. The New World has the fewest number of famines listed, but I think that may just be a function of archival bias. Famines are deadly. They can have long-term consequences, not only for the death or ill health of individuals, but for communities and nations. Most of you are probably familiar with the effect of the Irish potato famine in the 1840s on Ireland, where a third of the population died, a third of the population migrated. Some of you are probably where you are because of that. Even a worse example is the Kazakh famine of 1940s, where 1/4 of the Kazakhs died, where the traditional Kazakh nomad lifestyle was completely destroyed. And it wasn't until 1990 that ethnic Kazakhs became majority in their own country of Kazakhstan. But famines, which get most attention, are not the only kind of food shortages. There are hunger seasons. There are periods of time when food stores are low and people just tighten the belt. And there are other kinds of small-scale food shortages. Because how common they are, because of the existential threat they face to people and societies, you would expect there'd be a large number of techniques and strategies people would use to deal with these food shortages. And one of the ones that often is the most common is eating famine foods. And I'm going to focus mostly on plants and not animals. And if that doesn't explain it or get you to thinking about how important it is, just think, would you ever exist if your ancestor hadn't eaten famine foods? Going back 10, 20, 50, 100 generations, they probably faced a large number of food shortages. And if they hadn't have eaten famine foods, they quite likely would have not have survived, and you wouldn't be here. If that personalizes it, so much the better. So famine foods are an incredibly important topic. There have been famines in the past. There are famines right now. Yemen and Tigray province in Ethiopia are seen to be particular problems. And if the past and the present is a guide, it's going to happen into the future as much as we can try to stop it. Now, the book itself, I have several chapters which are overviews of what are the kinds of plants that are used and what's the context and how does strategies that people use relate to the use of famine foods. But I wanted to look at case studies, and I took these 14 case studies. They include some hunting and gathering groups, foragers like the San of South Africa and the Aboriginal Australians and Northwest coast of North America, village farming groups that aren't a part of really urbanized nation states at the time, the US Southwest, Papua New Guinea, and the Gwembe Tonga of South Central Africa. And then most of the case study, I forgot the circumpolar as foraging groups. And then a number of groups, nation states, urbanized nations, both at peace, like Ireland, or China or India, where there's a lot of information, and also during war. And I looked at Greece, Netherlands, the siege of Leningrad, and World War II in the Pacific. The siege of Leningrad is particularly interesting. So we've taken these 4 case studies that range in a lot of different kinds of societies scattered about the world, except for South America, as you can see, to try to see what kinds of plants used, how they used them, and how they kept people alive. Now, when people think of famine foods, I think they think of 2 things primarily: relief supplies, those big sacks of flour or whatever, they're airshipped into to stricken populations. And then often people think of native plants that are known to be barely edible, things that people would normally eat, but if more familiar or common rations are not available, they eat those. And those are important famine foods. But there are a whole lot of other things. I think by just limiting it to those 2, we limit our understanding of how the use of resources happen during food shortages. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's certain things like agricultural refuse or using crops in other ways. So example, my favorite example is during the Dutch hunger season of 1944. One of the primary famine foods were tulip bulbs. Makes kind of sense when you think about it. You know, I imagine toward the end of World War II, there wasn't a great market for tulips, and there were a lot of bulbs. There was one bulb producer who pointed out he sold 25,000 tons of bulbs to be used as food, and the Dutch government provided cookbooks on how to cook tulip bulbs. And that's just using a crop in an atypical way. Eating green mangoes before they ripen would be another thing. It's a crop, but you eat them in atypical ways, and tabooed foods, etc. Anyway, I discuss all of these in the book. The point is, there are lots of different kinds of famine foods, and it made sense, I think, to cast the net very, very widely so we can see how people use these foods in order to survive during times of deep trouble. This is, by the way, a picture of charlock, which, as far as I can tell, was one of the most important wild famine foods used by the Irish peasants. But the question is, why study these things simply beyond the obvious of they can help keep people alive, which is enough of a reason. But I think there's some other reasons. One of them is to reimagine crops. So we got to think of corn. And if you read the ethnographies or descriptions or historical narratives of populations that are having severe problems, often corn cobs are an important famine food. They're basically ground up and added to grains and other things to just extend or augment. It helps satiety, feeling of satiety, but it doesn't add much value, nutritional value. Beans, we think of beans, but bean leaves are an important famine food, as well as squash leaves and those sorts of things, or the rinds of squash that might be thrown away otherwise. The corn cob is particularly interesting because it has no, almost as is, even if it's just ground up, it's basically fiber, it has no value. But I think there have people been trying to see if they can convert the lignin and the cellulose in corn cobs into things that are actually edible to humans. And that could be very, very valuable. So crops reimagined, even the three sisters. If we think of Famine Foods, we can think of crops in a broader way than we do normally. And one of the things that struck me is when I was looking at this, there are all kinds of plants that we wouldn't think are edible that are. In fact, there are several studies of groups in Africa and other areas where one community knows what to eat and the next village over doesn't. And so by spreading this information, we expand the possible edibles that people can use when there are deep problems. My favorite example for those of you in Western North America is Tribulus terrestris, goat's head, or puncture vine. If you bicycle, walk without shoes, or have a dog, you hate this plant. The fruits have these really sharp spines. It is an enormously loathed plant. In fact, a person who wrote The Weeds of Arizona said this is the most loathsome plant introduced. And given how we think about it, I think all of us would be surprised that this was a major famine food in parts of India and West Africa. It literally kept hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people alive. So it's a plant that we would not think is edible, but in fact has helped keep people alive. The dried fruits can be ground into a powder, into a flour. It doesn't have much nutritional value. However, the greens evidently are very nutritious, more nutritious than most weedy greens. And so here's a plant that if you grew up or lived in Western North America, and I don't know if Tansy is in Canada, it's certainly up in Oregon and Washington. It's a loathsome plant, and we'd all be surprised that here's something that we wouldn't think is in fact an edible plant that has kept people alive, but it has. Or if you're in the Southeast United States, you know this plant, kudzu, Japanese invasive, that has a habit of, in this case, covering buildings and trees and roads. And it's just an absolutely loathsome, problematic plant. And I think if you live in the Southeast, you might be surprised to know that the roots of kudzu were a major famine food in Papua New Guinea and had been used in Southeast Asia. So famine foods, I think, study of famine foods, the fact, even despite the fact that it really hasn't been studied very much, has potential beyond simply allowing us to understand what, in fact, people eat and how they eat it when there are food shortages, but how we might take this information and use it in other ways. So that's all I have to say with the PowerPoint. I think I'm just trying to say how important I think this famine food study, even though it tends to be viewed as an obscure and probably unimportant niche. And I think that's actually incorrect. So Nancy, you want to take it over?
Sure thing, Paul. Thank you ever so much. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot from that, even though I've read your wonderful book, of course. But it's always good to have the reminders, and the photographs really help as well. I've known Paul for many years, as Allison said, and he's one of my heroes in ethnobiology. I have to say that to make him embarrassed. See, he's blushing already.
It worked.
And it's really good to be here with all of you who obviously have an interest in this important topic. This book is a wonderful contribution to our understanding of the role of famine foods worldwide, and it represents decades of detailed research by one of America's top ethnobiologists. Again, blush, yes. Dr. Minnis draws on multiple sources to create this unique compendium of plants that humans have turned to during times of food scarcity. Critically important to peoples of the past, this knowledge may be just as important to future populations. As Paul has already mentioned, famines are an ongoing crisis in many parts of the world, and they're likely to continue into the future. Plants have always served humans as sources of diverse, nutritious foods. In times of famine, whether due to natural or human-induced circumstances, these same plants, along with other species and plant parts not normally eaten, as Paul has described, have been critical in alleviating hunger and starvation. Knowing what famine plants are available in a given area and time, and how to use and prepare them, is a critically important part of any group's cultural heritage and knowledge. And as Paul has mentioned, all of the world's peoples have suffered from hunger at one time or another. And as an ethnobotanist, I've been interested in this topic for a long time myself. I remember reading Eidlitz as food and emergency food of the circumpolar region back in the 1960s when I was just starting out. And later on, I co-authored a book called Edible Garden Weeds of Canada, which really encompassed a number of the plants that are considered famine foods. But so people rely and fall back on things that are growing as weeds in their gardens or along roadsides or whatever. And many of them are indeed nutritious, although they might not be as flavorful as some of the plants that people have domesticated. But nevertheless, they're used and provide really important additional food at times of need. The ways that we've coped with food shortages and famine have been both distressing and inspiring, reflecting the flexibility and the resilience of people in the face of hunger and the immense social and political impacts, whether from our own short-sightedness and negligence, whether caused by climatic or geological events entirely beyond our control, or whether imposed by diabolical racist or short-sighted political acts. As Paul has already alluded to, famines have occurred throughout history among indigenous communities in different parts of the world, among agricultural communities, and within cities and urban areas. Based on a wide-ranging literature review and analysis, Dr. Minnis, Paul, describes different situations that have resulted in famine, the types and parts of plants and fungi and algae documented to have been used at times of famine, and how these have differed in various cultural and geographical settings over a broad timescale. So this is really a very important book, and it's one that I think will be used long into the future as a standard reference and as we think about these things and how we can live better in the world. So Paul, thank you for writing this book. That's the first thing. The quantity and the quality of the data that you bring together is truly astounding. The tables in particular reflect such a vast amount of compilation and analysis with immense detail throughout. You've been interested in this topic of emergency and famine foods for a long time now, I know this. How did you, as an archaeologist, come to be interested in this subject?
Well, like so many things, it was a tangent. My dissertation was on arguing that several ancient culture in Southwest New Mexico basically had food stress, and that's ultimately led to its reorganization or decline. And as an adjunct to that, I was looking at famine foods. And what I found is, I was kind of appalled. I found that there's very little on that botanists and biologists tend to have lists of foods that were quote famine foods, but no context. Who used them? How were they used? Who knew about the knowledge? The kinds of questions social scientists tend to ask. And in reverse, historians and anthropologists tended to have the context about the plants, but with using things like weeds or roots or grass, a level of specificity is pretty not very useless. And there are very few studies that kind of put the social science together with the biological science, which is where, as Nancy and I are longtime ethnobiology members, going back to the first or second meeting decades ago, that's one of the advantages of ethnobiology. It brings together biologists and social scientists, and it's very, very productive in that way. And so I did an article in 91 on famine foods of the Southwest, and then I got waylaid doing other stuff. And I got a number of other books taken care of. I needed to get taken care of. And I just wanted, this is the latest book. It's what I really wanted to look at. And it was an absolute joy to get an idea of how famine foods are used across different kinds of societies. It's also kind of depressing to read all this stuff too. So as an adjunct to the archaeological research. The other thing is, one thing archaeology does, like history, is it gives us an historical dimension. Famine foods don't stay the same. People's diets change through time, and as an archaeologist, that's something that we just know, and that's what we study. And a lot of this histories or a lot of ethnographies tend to be sliced in time, and so they have a great deal of detail, but they often lack an historical dimension. So I argued in the Southwest example that when the Spanish came in and the dramatic changes the Spanish wrought to indigenous subsistence practices and economies changed greatly the kinds of foods that were considered famine foods. And so it was sort of a logical outcome, but like so much of what we do, we're working on a project and it leads to tangents that get very interesting in and of themselves.
And very important too. For all of you who are here with us, you'll have a chance, if you have some burning questions for Paul, I'll ask him a couple more, and then we'll open the floor to anybody who would want to ask a question, and you can do that through the chat line. Probably most of you are pretty familiar with Zoom meetings these days, as they've been going on for a while. So yeah, we'll look at the chat and try and pull out your questions as best we can. So Paul, another book of your books that is one of my favorites, of course, is Biodiversity in Native America. And you obviously have a strong interest in biodiversity and biocultural diversity. And do you see a relationship between famine foods and biodiversity conservation in the past and today?
Oh, absolutely. Remember I mentioned Robert Freeman's very wonderful database. It has 1,600 plants.
I think he's here with us today.
Yeah, he is. And if he wants to add comments, I'd love to have him. In 1,600 plants, from 190 plant families. Now, according to the Kew Garden, there's about 400 and something odd known plant families. Is that right, Nancy?
And I don't know, Paul. I'm sorry.
Well, I read that. I thought you were a real botanist. Oh, well.
No.
But anyway, Kew Gardens has 400 and something known families, plant families. And Bob's database has famine foods in 190 of those, or 40%. Of the families, known families, have at least one famine food, and some of them, like the bean family, have 160 that are in his database. Now, I think, and he's done an amazing work, but I think my guess is there are probably closer to 30 to 40,000 famine foods, and they just haven't been recorded. And if that's the case, since famine foods are spread out throughout the botanical world, almost probably in every family, and this would include fungus and things of that nature, which people tend to think of as plants, but technically aren't, then biodiversity is critical. As you reduce biodiversity, you clearly are going to reduce the number of potentially edible plants. I mean, it's as absolutely simple as that. And it's really important because there's a question, a guy named Thayer Scudder, I call it the Scudder hypothesis. And that is, hunters and gatherers have a wide number of plants and animals they know and use. And the question is, when people become village farmers, do they lose some of that knowledge? That is, when they add crops, do they lose knowledge of edible plants in the environment or not? And it's a good question. And my answer would be, and I used a very crude kind of study, but I think it probably is additive. Thayer Scudder said, with higher population densities, you got to have more backup. As simple as that. And the data is not fabulous, but I think it's probably additive, and it's certainly not subtractive. I don't think the idea that with increased farming, village farmers, local farmers lose knowledge of the botanical environment is not correct. If that's the case, then biodiversity tends to even be more important when you get farming. Where the biodiversity kind of becomes perhaps less important is when you get to urbanized landscapes. Urban populations just simply don't have the biodiversity, the biomass, and they have too high population density. But for us thinking about what are the edible plants or that people can use, I 30,000. There are 28,000 known medicinal plants. And I think in terms of famine food, you could probably suggest that it's probably on that order.
Mhm.
And so we're still a lot to do. Bob Freeman he's done a fabulous job, but he's limited to what he could do. And that 1600 is the very best data set there is. But I think there's a lot more information out there that people ought to be looking for.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. I was delighted to see that you dedicated your book to two ethnobotanists who are very well known, Volney Jones and our dear friend Richard I. Ford. And I just wondered, why you chose those two to dedicate your book to.
Well, like everybody, we owe debts that we can never repay. And for example, my high school biology teacher that got me interested in plants. I was interested in archaeology since actually elementary school, but I got interested in botany in high school because of her. And in 11th grade, I said, oh my God, botany or archaeology is an existential crisis. In 12th grade, I found out you could put the two together. So that was the end of the existential crisis by 12th grade. But as an undergraduate, I went to 4 schools as an undergraduate. I worked full time and went to school full time for 2.5 years. It was not conducive for a whole lot of extra academic effort. And so I wasn't able to do a whole lot with ethnobotany. And then I went to grad school at Michigan, which is fabulous for archaeology. But I went there because it had the ethnobotany lab, which was founded in 1932. And it's just a gold mine for somebody interested in that. It's just absolutely fabulous. Dick Ford was the director, who's now retired in Santa Fe. And he took an obnoxious grad student from Colorado and did the best he could to mold me into a scholar, I guess. But even equally interesting was his dissertation advisor, retired Volney Jones, who was hired, I think, in the 1930s. And so with the two of them, there was a knowledge of ethnobiology, mostly of North America and heavily of the Southwest, where was my area of interest, going back to the 1930s. And it was just unbelievable to have these resources there. And so I owe an unrepayable debt to the late Volney Jones and also to Dick Ford. They deserve more than that, but that's all I could give them.
Well, that's a pretty nice tribute to two amazing men, and I have to concur. I never knew of Volney Jones. Of course, I knew of him, but for me, Richard Ford is just one of those people who has stood out all the way along as someone who supports students, inspires, and his work has just been groundbreaking in so many ways. So,
Agreed.
so I'm really pleased that you did that. That was really nice.
Thank you.
Well, we're just emerging, we hope, from a global pandemic, but we're still facing ongoing climate change and increased incidents of droughts and fires and floods and sea level rise and all the things that go with this global warming. Are there lessons that you've learned from your own research about famines that might be applied to present and future generations facing these really difficult times?
Well, yes and no. Now, the problem is the world's population is increasingly become living in cities. And for knowing about famine foods, that is very problematic because the biodiversity in cities and the ability to get to areas that have traditional famine foods is often very, very limited. Could you imagine 25 million people in Mexico City suddenly going out and trying to forage? It's not a pretty picture. So what needs to be done, I think there are a couple of things. One is gather as much information. There's some really good scholars in China and India in particular who are gathering this information before it's lost. And to know what these plants are and see if any of them have what kind of value they have, and to actually have databases like Bob Freeman's database of what's edible. Because when I read about the nation states, too often governments don't pay any attention or insufficient attention with what kind of resources are out there. So one of my favorite books is the Zhuang Ben Cao, and my apologies for any Chinese speaker, which was published in the late 1400s by Prince Zhu. And it's a list of 114 famine foods. It is an unbelievable reference, and it's actually been reprinted twice now in modern China. But when you read about the famines in China, of which there's quite a bit on, I don't think the government, for example, really did an adequate job of letting people know what's out there and what is edible. And the data it was available there. Also, as I mentioned earlier, how to take agricultural products or things that don't have much nutritional value, and how can you chemically or biochemically get them to get as much nutrition as possible, like corn cobs. Corn cobs have been used a lot because they just have a bit of flour, you add some ground up corn cobs, and it extends the food, and they may fill a belly, but it doesn't add a lot of nutrition. But there's actually an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science where they're able to take the chemicals in corn cobs and get some nutrition that was useful for humans. And so there are a lot of things that I think governments have to do to prepare and for this eventuality. And it's particularly important it's particularly important for urbanized groups. You can store as much as food as possible, but it doesn't always work. The siege of Leningrad, for example, they had storehouses of food, and the problem is the Germans bombed it, and that destroyed so much of the food overnight. And so you have to have as many strategies as possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Paul, and thanks everyone. Now we've more or less finished our part of this, except for Paul, who will be willing, we hope, to answer more questions. And we have people here from, well, I don't know if Roger's still with us, but from Dorset in the UK, which is very, very early tomorrow morning where he is. And we're glad he could come, and lots of other folks from Alexandria, Virginia, Flagstaff, Phoenix, and a lot of people around Arizona, of course. Sarah Walsha from Vancouver, which is really nice to see. And she mentions, congratulations, Paul, on the publication of this book on behalf of the Society of Ethnobiology. I look forward to assigning this for my African food history class this summer. How has some of the famine food knowledge been impacted by shame imposed on some of these practices and knowledge by European colonizers? What a good question, Sarah.
I'm not sure. Would you say shame?
Yeah, because
but it's not just with colonialization and Western colonization. There's a general concern with one of the problems of where people wouldn't use famine foods is that they have a low status. That actually, and there are a number of examples in tribal groups where elites, wouldn't eat it, but then they'd hide it when they would eat it, or other things, tabooed foods in particular. So I think the problem with colonialization, and particularly with India and the Raj, and in cases with Africa in the 20th century, the 19th century, was disruptions of economic systems. So it wasn't the fact that these foods were shameful, but the big problem is they disrupted the economic systems very, very badly. And so people couldn't necessarily use the strategies they normally use. But there is famine foods don't have high status, and some people would not eat them because they don't have high status. But that's not a recent phenomena. It's not a phenomena just associated with Western colonialism. It actually happens. I've read a number of examples where people were hesitant to either eat or to say they ate. The Greek famine of 1944 was not too bad as famines go, but a lot of the elites would not eat greens, which they saw as kind of a poor rural food, and who'd want to eat those sorts of things? It's really low status. So it happens. It has happened probably throughout history, especially when you start getting class differences between people.
Reminds me that I heard that the soup called minestrone in Italian cuisine actually originated as a soup of country people with wild greens in it.
Yeah. And those greens can be important. There's during one of the Bahar famine, I think it was in the late 1900s, no, not late 20th century, 20th century, the Dalits, who were the poorest, they lived on greens. I mean, they had 73 species of greens they would eat, and during famines, they would say how they would get by for 4 or 5 months eating even more greens.
Yes. Sorry, a slight distraction.
Oh, well, okay. I can get rid of them. I can say what people eat in terms of animals during famines, and pets are hot. Oh, see, he's leaving.
It's our grand cat.
Okay.
Anyway, sorry for the disruption. Yeah, thank you. We have a couple related questions here now. Let's see. Oh, there's a number. We've got Sarah James. Does the book have any extensive coverage of the desert Southwest? And then from Dave, thank you for sharing this research. Nancy briefly alluded to some broader benefits knowledge of famine foods can offer to society. Can you too elaborate and give some possible examples for the US Southwest, Northwestern Mexico beyond survival and medicinal uses?
Well, there is, I wrote an article on famine foods of the desert borderland Southwest in 1991, and I do abstract it in the book. So that's one of the case studies, actually. You know, one of the big problems that we're going to have is dealing with probably increasing drought and heat. And the main concern has been, how do we take crops that aren't very important and try to use them? And that's actually a concern that people have been concerned with for over 100 years. Tepary beans, for example, are incredibly drought resistant. Can they be a good crop? Or are there others as well? One of the issues is, are there things that are known as famine foods or not preferred foods that actually are local and well adapted to the environment that might be a crop? That could be turned into a crop, and that's a tough one. And every time that's been asked, you know, there's been some interest in it, but it's sort of waned. The question is it going to wane as we get drier, as the Colorado River dries up, and as it gets hotter in the desert? And so looking for desert adapted plants that might become crops. And then there's always foraging. But, you know, when you have 4 million people in Phoenix, there's probably not enough stuff that they could forage to keep them alive. And that's why relief efforts are so important. But for rural populations, where the population density is lower, they could probably get by if need be on foraging and using things that they normally wouldn't eat. But when you're talking about large cities, the traditional knowledge is not directly applicable. Now, the Dutch went out for weeks on end into the rural countryside on hunger trips, but that was basically to barter with farmers. And it's in the winter in Dutch. I imagine there's in Holland. I imagine there's not a whole lot of stuff to eat. So people have done that, and you do get people migrate out of urban areas. But, you know, when you have populations of 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 million in urban areas, the population is so high, other strategies are going to be needed. I don't know if Nancy agrees or not with that.
No, I agree. And I think one thing we could do, though, if you go into any city in North America and stand on a rooftop somewhere and look over, you see huge, vast areas of rooftops and lawns, not to mention roads and parking lots. And all of these are taking away from plants growing and food production systems. And I think even if we thought about... Sorry, that's our grand dog. If we thought
he's barking Canadian.
Yes, he is. Although he's from California. But anyways, if we thought about more edible landscaping projects for all of us, just to have edible plants on hand for everyday use, but to fall back on if we need them, I think we could do a lot better than what we're doing now in terms of using the space that we have. And doing that, the more photosynthetic uh, opportunities that plants have in our earth, the better we're all going to be in terms of climate change and oxygen production and carbon sequestration. So I think these things are tied together.
Great, thank you.
Sarah has a question here. I know you mentioned the famine foods of China and the issue of the famine in China during the Great Leap. North Korea also faced massive famine of the late 1990s. Was access to information a reason you weren't able to touch on the famine there, especially as it is a famine within a very recent memory? Have you done any research in that area? Also, hi, Paul. I greatly enjoyed reading the book as I typeset it.
Oh, great, thank you. I actually have a couple paragraphs on North Korea. There's a there's a guy named Natsios who wrote a book on the famine. But there's not a whole lot on the famine food use. There's an incredible amount written on famines, but I was looking at famine food use and you're fairly limited of where the data goes, where you can get really good information. So I wanted to originally do the siege of Stalingrad, but there was nothing on it, on the use of famine. Lots on the siege of Stalingrad, but almost nothing on the famine food use. And it turned out there's quite a bit in the siege of Leningrad. And so you sort of have to go where the data is. Papua New Guinea is really good because a lot of Australians have done an enormous amount of work on the subsistence economies of Papua New Guinea. So you go where you can when you're dealing with a topic that hasn't been systematically studied very well. I'm sure there are other case studies that are very good. China and India are very good. I wish I read Chinese and Russian because I think I might get more that I missed. Everything I had was either in Spanish or in English. But China in particular, but also Russia, I think there may be more there than, I think I got really a good amount because there's a lot of translations, but I think there's probably a lot more there to be able to be mined. This is mostly an overview. When you're dealing with 14 case studies, you can't go into an enormous detail. I'm looking more for sort of broader patterns. Yeah, there's so much more to be done, and I hope somebody does it.
Sarah says that makes sense. And Dave, and maybe I'll supplement that with the question of my own, because my dad was an entomologist, and once I gave him a book called "Why Not Eat Insects," just almost as a joke, but actually a lot of people do eat insects, and some of us think of them as being loathsome, but some of them are pretty good. Anyways,
well, they're incredibly nutritious. I mean, insects. I mean, Nancy, remember early on at every ethnobiology meeting, there'd be somebody who'd give a talk about insects as food, and we're all sitting there smiling politely.
Yes, I took a bunch back to my classes, and I passed them around, grasshoppers. And I was talking, and all through the lecture, I'd hear, ew, ew, as students tried them around the room.
You know, last week, BBC had a video on its webpage about the superfood that everybody ignores, and is about insects as food. So, I'm not sure about loathsome. You know, where it really gets loathsome is when you talk about animals. When you actually talk about animals as famine food, that's when it really gets pretty disgusting. I can't tell you what, kudzu is pretty miserable as a loathsome plant that is very, very useful. Sandbur is not a particularly great grass. It sticks to your socks, and it was an edible plant as well. So there are a whole bunch of them.
Well, we're getting on to I guess the time when everyone's about ready to go on to other things. I don't see any more questions here. Does anyone in our audience have any more burning questions that you'd like to pose? Now's the time. And Paul, do you have any other comments that you'd like to make or follow-ups to some of the questions?
No, I think I appreciate the questions. I appreciate your attention, and the book's fairly short, and I think it's not too technically written. But it's a topic, again, that I think if you come away anything from this, it's a topic that you may have thought was irrelevant or minor or obscure or a little niche in food science. But I think the fact that it hasn't been studied much is a shame, because I think the potential and the importance of famine foods is far greater than the amount of effort people have put into studying them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question from Ben. You mentioned that governments tend not to make their populations aware of famine foods that are available. Are there examples where governments did help out in this way? Good question.
Yes. One of the best studies I think the best study of famine food use was by some biologists who looked at the Dutch hunger season. And they went through they got government archives, and they also interviewed, believe it or not, they interviewed survivors 73 years later and got information on famine food use. But what the Dutch government did, and a number of them, they put out books on what you can eat. The Norwegians did the same thing, what's out there to eat. And they also gave, as I said earlier, they had cookbooks on how to cook tulip bulbs. And there are these wonderful pictures of the women sitting around, like, just peeling and cooking and cutting up the tulip bulbs like you would potatoes. So the Dutch government, I think, did a pretty good job. It was a fairly limited famine. About 25,000 people died. But as famines go, it was fairly limited in a fairly literate and literate and fairly wealthy country. So there's a lot more to be done. When government in North Korea, for example, that came up, North Korea put out some information on stuff you could eat. And in the book I mentioned, he said how disgusting these are. And I'm thinking, this is exactly what most governments, in fact, the information they put out. But so governments like India or China have put out lists of some plants, but they don't do the full dimension of information, which is too bad. And there really needs to be a lot more. And this information is cheap. It doesn't. Botanists work cheap, right, Nancy? Archaeologists and anthropologists work cheap, and cultural anthropologists. Getting this information is not that expensive, and it's information where you don't know what the value will be in the long term. But we spend a lot of time preserving crops. There are seed banks all throughout the world. And people spend a long time gathering seeds to make sure that we don't lose this diversity of crop germplasm. Well, we ought to do the same thing for memory of foods you should eat when there's nothing else to eat. And again, it's not expensive to get that information, and you can get it even years after. It's best to talk to survivors right away or talk to people beforehand. But, there have been some studies of the Irish potato famine where they've talked to people 2 or 3 generations removed from it, and there's still knowledge about some of the foods they were eating. A lot of that knowledge is lost, but there's still some basic knowledge there. So I think it's something, if there's attention paid to it, we could get a lot more information and minimally store it in the back of our mind and use it when it's needed. And if we don't know it, we can't use that information.
Yeah. So this is a really good follow-up to that, Jane's comment. And we might all have relatives who've been in this situation in the past, as you've noted. But she says, thanks for the program. My father's maternal grandparents starved to death after World War II in Berlin. My dad loved cats, but he said that in famine, they were alley rabbits.
Oh, animals disappear. Zoo animals disappear. Pets disappear. People are grossed out by that. But, if you read about famines, I've never had a famine. I've never been part of famine. I hope I never am. It is a horrible, horrible, horrible experience that you can't understand. And so you can't really blame people when they just eat whatever they can eat.
That's right.
And it's a serious problem when it happens. And again, it's happening now. Yemen, a lot of aid can't get into Yemen because of the belligerents aren't particularly friendly to relief supplies. Seems to be this. There's a potential famine beginning in Tigray province and other places. So we need to have all of our eggs in the basket. We need as many tools in our toolbox in order to try to keep people alive so people don't starve to death, because it's not a very pleasant way to go, and it has long-term ramifications for the society. As people, I don't know how many people watching are Irish ancestry, but probably not more. There are probably a few of them whose great grandparents came over on the famine ships. It was that or die.
Yeah, so it's something that impacts all of us one way or another and will into the future. And I think that's a good place maybe to wrap it up, and to ask Alice and Carter to maybe make a few last words, and want to thank all of you from myself and from Paul for being with us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Paul and Nancy, for sharing your time with us tonight. Tonight's event could not have happened without the support of our colleagues at the University of Arizona Press and our University of Arizona Libraries family. For more information on our books and future events, please visit our website, uapress.arizona.edu, where you can also purchase tonight's. Finally, thank you, tonight's book. Finally, thanks to all of you who joined us all the way from across various ponds and across the country. And the best part of publishing books like Famine Foods is the opportunity to share them. So thank you to all tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And thank you, Nancy.
My
And
pleasure,
Alice.
Paul. It's good to be with all of you.